The golden chandeliers of La Royale cast a warm glow over the elegant dining room, where the city's wealthiest patrons indulged in fine wine and exquisite cuisine. The restaurant was the kind of place where the elite gathered, where money spoke louder than words, and where anyone who didn't belong was quickly reminded of it. Then, the doors swung open. A man stepped inside, Daniel Carter, dressed in a worn-out jacket, his shoes scuffed from years of walking. He carried himself with quiet dignity, but the moment he entered, the atmosphere in the restaurant shifted. A few guests turned their heads, their eyes scanning him up and down. Some whispered. Others smirked. Near the bar, Edward Sinclair, the owner of La Royale, lifted his glass of whiskey and took a slow sip before setting it down. His sharp, calculating gaze locked onto Daniel, his lips curving into a smug grin. "Excuse me, sir," he called out, his voice dripping with condescension. "Are you lost?" Daniel took a breath. "I'd like to have a meal here." The words lingered in the air, as if he had just said something utterly ridiculous. A few nearby guests chuckled. One even shook his head, muttering, "Unbelievable." Edward raised an eyebrow. "I don't think you understand," he said. "This is La Royale. We don't just serve anyone who walks in." Daniel kept his posture steady, meeting Edward's gaze. "I have money," he said, pulling a few crumpled bills from his pocket. A brief silence. Then, Edward laughed, a slow, deliberate laugh that spread throughout the room. "Money?" he scoffed, leaning forward. "Oh, I see. You think a few scraps of cash make you worthy of dining here." The laughter grew, rippling through the restaurant like an inside joke that only the wealthy could understand. Behind them, a waitress, Sophia Lane, stood frozen, watching the scene unfold. She recognized the cruelty in Edward's tone, but there was nothing she could do. Edward took another sip of his whiskey, then set his glass down with a sharp clink. "Let me make this simple for you." He snapped his fingers. Immediately, 2 security guards appeared. "Escort this man out. He's lowering the value of my establishment." The guards grabbed Daniel's arms, shoving him toward the door. His worn-out shoes scraped against the polished marble floor. He didn't fight back, didn't beg for a second chance. He simply let them push him outside. The last thing he heard before the doors closed behind him was Edward's voice, taunting him one last time. "Remember this moment, boy. Because no matter how hard you try, you will never belong here." The restaurant erupted in laughter again. Daniel stood outside, staring at the glowing sign of La Royale. He could still hear them laughing. But he wasn't angry. He wasn't broken. As the cold night air settled around him, he made a silent promise. 5 years. Give me 5 years. And I will come back. Not as a guest. Not as a beggar. But as the owner of everything they think I could never have. The city had never been kind to people like Daniel Carter. Born into poverty, he learned early that the world had little patience for those without wealth, status, or connections. His mother worked 2 exhausting jobs just to keep food on the table, and every day was a fight to survive. While other children talked about summer vacations or weekend outings, Daniel was out in the streets, looking for odd jobs to bring home even a few extra dollars. There was no such thing as luxury in his world. Clothes were always secondhand, meals were simple, and the idea of dining in a high-end restaurant was as foreign to him as a different planet. But Daniel never allowed himself to sink into bitterness. He didn't waste time envying those who had more, he spent his time studying them. As a teenager, he took whatever jobs he could find, stocking shelves at grocery stores, scrubbing floors at fast food restaurants, delivering newspapers at dawn before heading to school. While his classmates spent evenings playing video games or hanging out at shopping malls, Daniel was either working or at the library. He devoured books on finance, business, real estate, and investing, filling his mind with knowledge that no school was willing to teach him. If he wasn't reading, he was listening, absorbing the words of self-made billionaires who had built their wealth from nothing. He studied their strategies, learned about risk, investment, and the power of branding. But reading and learning weren't enough. He needed to see how the wealthy lived. So, on his rare days off, he would dress as neatly as he could and walk through the expensive parts of the city, silently observing. He took note of how the elite spoke, how they moved, where they spent their money, what restaurants they dined in. He learned the difference between true wealth and those who only pretended to have it. He memorized the way high-end establishments treated their VIP clients, how exclusivity wasn't just about money, but about perception and power. And then came the night that changed everything. Daniel had been working as a janitor at a large corporate office, cleaning floors after hours. It was a job no one paid attention to. People walked past him as if he were invisible, talking freely as if he weren't there. But that night, while mopping the hallway outside an executive lounge, he overheard a conversation that made him stop in his tracks. Two businessmen were discussing a struggling restaurant chain that was on the verge of shutting down. It had once been a high-end dining experience, but due to poor management, it was bleeding money. No one wanted to touch it. The investors were planning to sell it off for almost nothing just to cut their losses. To most people, it was a bad investment. To Daniel, it was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. He spent that entire night researching everything he could about the restaurant, its debts, its assets, its market potential. He analyzed its failures, pinpointed what had gone wrong, and realized something incredible. The restaurant wasn't failing because people didn't want fine dining. It was failing because it had lost its identity. The branding was outdated, the menu uninspired, and the management disconnected from modern luxury trends. Daniel did the unthinkable. With every single dollar he had saved over the years, combined with a small business loan that he barely qualified for, he bought the failing restaurant. People called him insane. Friends and co-workers told him he was making the biggest mistake of his life. But Daniel knew what he was doing. For the next 5 years, he worked relentlessly. He didn't just fix the restaurant, he transformed it. He studied the world's most successful luxury dining experiences, hired the best chefs he could afford, and rebuilt the brand from the ground up. He learned how the rich thought, how they wanted to be seen, and he crafted an experience that was more than just about food, it was about status. He carefully curated an exclusive image, marketing the restaurant as a place for the elite, an establishment where only those who truly understood luxury would dine. He hosted private tastings for influential figures, invited critics from high-end magazines, and slowly, word spread. Within a few years, his restaurant wasn't just surviving, it was one of the most exclusive dining experiences in the city. And now? It was time. Daniel had built an empire from nothing, but there was still one last thing left to do. 5 years ago, he had walked into La Royale and been thrown out like he was worthless. He still remembered the laughter, the smirks, the humiliation. He had made himself a promise that night. And now, he was about to keep it. Because this time, he wasn't walking into La Royale as a beggar. This time, he was coming to take everything they had ever denied him. The air inside La Royale was thick with a quiet hum of wealth, polished silverware clinking against fine china, soft jazz playing in the background, and the low murmur of conversation between the city's elite. Waiters moved swiftly between tables, pouring glasses of expensive wine, presenting dishes plated like works of art. It was the kind of place where the rich came to remind themselves of their status, where the walls themselves seemed to whisper, "You belong here," and they don't. But tonight, someone had entered who wasn't supposed to belong. The moment Daniel Carter stepped through the doors, the atmosphere shifted. It wasn't the outright hostility he had encountered 5 years ago, when he had been nothing but a poor man daring to exist in a place meant for the wealthy. No one was openly sneering, no one was laughing in his face. But there was something else, a quiet, uncertain curiosity. People noticed him. Not because they recognized him, but because of the way he carried himself. Daniel wasn't trying to blend in. He wasn't timid or hesitant. He walked with a kind of measured confidence that only came from a man who had nothing to prove, but everything to claim. His custom-tailored suit, the way it fit him flawlessly, the understated luxury of his watch, the quiet authority in his stride. Everything about him spoke of a man who had power. And in a place like La Royale, power was the only language that mattered. At the bar, a group of executives glanced toward him, whispering amongst themselves. "Who is that?" one of them muttered. "I don't know, but he looks important." Daniel smirked to himself as he adjusted his cufflinks. 5 years ago, they had looked at him like he was invisible. Now they were trying to figure out if they should already know his name. But there was only one person in this room whose recognition truly mattered. And then, across the dimly lit restaurant, Edward Sinclair looked up from his table. Their eyes met. And Daniel saw it. The exact moment recognition dawned on the man's face. For just a second, Edward froze, his usually confident, smug expression flickering with something else. Confusion. Shock. Even fear. The whiskey glass in his hand stopped halfway to his lips, his grip tightening around the crystal stem. Daniel didn't break eye contact. He wanted Edward to feel it. Wanted him to truly understand who he was looking at. And then, as if forcing himself to recover, Edward straightened, setting his glass down with a slow, controlled movement. He adjusted the cuff of his tailored suit, as if reminding himself that this was his restaurant, his kingdom. He was still in control. Wasn't he? Edward pushed back his chair and stood, slipping effortlessly into the role he had played so well for years, the role of a man who believed he was untouchable. His lips curled into a polite, practiced smile as he approached Daniel, his expensive loafers making barely a sound against the polished marble floor. "Welcome to La Royale," he greeted smoothly, though there was something in his voice, something just slightly off balance. "Do you have a reservation?" Daniel let the words settle between them, let the moment stretch just enough for tension to coil in the air. Then, with deliberate ease, he reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a folded document. He didn't rush. He wanted Edward to feel every second of this. Then, with complete calm, Daniel placed the document on the nearest table. "I don't need a reservation," he said, his voice steady. "I own the place." Silence. A deep, suffocating silence wrapped around them like a vice. Edward didn't move. Didn't even blink. For a full 3 seconds, he simply stared at Daniel, as if his mind had refused to process the words. Then slowly, as if in a trance, his hand moved toward the document. He unfolded it, his fingers just barely trembling. The contract lay before him, the letters bold and undeniable. Daniel Carter, owner of La Royale. Edward's breath caught. His throat bobbed in a silent swallow. He scanned the page again, as if hoping he had somehow misread it. And then he finally understood. His body stiffened, his fingers tightening around the contract so hard that the edges of the paper crumpled slightly. This wasn't a mistake. This was real. Daniel watched the emotions flicker across Edward's face. Shock, disbelief, then finally creeping, dawning horror. The man who had once laughed in his face, who had humiliated him in front of an entire room of wealthy patrons, was now standing in his own restaurant, powerless. Daniel tilted his head slightly. "You don't look well, Edward." The words were calm, almost sympathetic. But Edward heard the razor-sharp edge behind them. Daniel took a step closer, lowering his voice just enough that only Edward could hear. "Maybe you should sit down." The insult was devastatingly quiet. And Edward felt it like a bullet to the chest. Edward Sinclair's world had never moved this slowly before. The restaurant he had built, the empire he had ruled over with absolute arrogance, now felt like it was closing in on him. The room had not changed, but somehow it felt smaller, the walls tighter, the chandeliers dimmer, the polished floors beneath him less steady. The paper in his trembling hands confirmed the impossible truth. Daniel Carter, owner of La Royale. The very man he had once thrown out like trash. Edward swallowed hard, his pulse hammering against his temple. He looked back up at Daniel, as if searching for some kind of explanation, some kind of mistake, some kind of way out. But Daniel? He just stood there, perfectly still, perfectly composed, watching him the way a lion watches a wounded animal. "This," Edward's voice cracked before he quickly cleared his throat. "This is some kind of joke." Daniel smirked. "No joke," he said, his voice smooth, effortless. "Just business." Edward's fingers curled into fists. "You think you can just walk in here and—" Daniel took a step closer, cutting off his words. "No, Edward. I don't think. I know." The weight behind those words landed like a hammer. For years, Edward had been the one in control, the one who dictated who was worthy and who wasn't. He had thrown countless people out of his establishment, made them feel small, powerless, invisible. And now? He was the one gasping for air. The hum of conversation in the restaurant had grown to a hush, the sound of fine dining fading into tense, absolute silence. Every waiter, every guest, every single person in the room was now watching the confrontation unfold. And then the final blow. Daniel reached into his pocket again, pulling out another document. He unfolded it, placed it neatly on the table next to the acquisition contract, and tapped his finger against it. "This," he said, "is your termination agreement." A cold chill crawled up Edward's spine. "My what?" he whispered, barely able to form the words. "You heard me." Daniel's voice was calm, lethal. "I'm not just buying La Royale. I'm getting rid of everything that's been dragging it down. And that starts with you." A ripple of murmurs spread through the restaurant. Gasps. Stifled whispers. People exchanging wide-eyed glances. Edward's hands shook. His breathing grew uneven. "You can't do this," he choked out. "This is my restaurant." Daniel exhaled slowly, shaking his head with an almost pitying look. "No, Edward," he said. "It was yours." Edward felt his knees weaken. His mind raced, desperately clawing for a way to turn this around. But there was no escape. He had signed his own downfall years ago, back when he grew arrogant, complacent, thinking that no one would ever dare to challenge his authority. And now, standing before him was the very man he had underestimated, the man he had humiliated in front of his guests, the man he had laughed at as security dragged him out onto the cold pavement. That same man now owned everything he had built. Daniel took a step back, giving Edward one last, deliberate look. "You made one mistake, Edward," he said. "You thought power was about keeping people out." He let those words hang in the air, the weight of them crushing down on Edward like a collapsing building. Then, with a small knowing smirk, Daniel gave a slight nod. Two security guards, the very same type of men Edward had once used to throw Daniel out, stepped forward. "Get him out of my restaurant," Daniel ordered. Edward panicked. His hands shot up, as if begging for some kind of reconsideration. "Daniel, wait, listen." But his words were cut off as the guards grabbed him by both arms. And just like that, Edward Sinclair was dragged out of La Royale, just as he had once done to Daniel. The irony was merciless. And every single person in the restaurant saw it. The heavy doors swung shut behind Edward, the sound echoing through the restaurant like the final nail in a coffin. Silence followed. And then, the first slow clap. Then another. And another. Until suddenly, the entire restaurant erupted into a standing ovation. People who had once laughed at Daniel were now applauding him. The staff who had spent years fearing Edward's wrath were now grinning, nodding in approval. And standing among them was Sophia Lane, the waitress who had been there that night, 5 years ago, the one who had seen it all. She smiled at Daniel, a look of knowing respect in her eyes. Daniel took in the moment, then turned toward the staff. "We're doing things differently now," he said, his voice commanding yet reassuring. "From this moment forward, La Royale is a place where people are treated with respect." A roar of approval erupted from the employees. And with that, the era of Edward Sinclair was over. And the reign of Daniel Carter had just begun. The heavy doors of La Royale had barely finished swinging shut behind Edward Sinclair when the realization sank in. The man who had once ruled this restaurant like a kingdom had just been dragged out like an unwanted guest, the same way he had thrown Daniel Carter out 5 years ago. And now, Daniel stood exactly where Edward had once stood, looking over the very restaurant that had once deemed him unworthy. The tables had turned, and every single person in the room knew it. The silence stretched as Daniel let his gaze sweep across the dining hall. The atmosphere had changed entirely. Where once there was arrogance and exclusivity, now there was something different. Respect. Admiration. And for some, even awe. The guests, the staff, the very walls of La Royale seemed to hum with the weight of what had just happened. The balance of power had shifted. And then, a voice broke through the quiet. "Sir, what would you like to do first?" Daniel turned to see Sophia Lane, the same waitress who had witnessed his humiliation all those years ago, the one who had seen it but had been powerless to stop it. But this time, there was something different in her expression. Not pity. Not sympathy. Respect. Daniel studied her for a brief moment before speaking, his voice even composed. "First, we take care of the people who actually make this place run." His gaze shifted toward the staff, the chefs, the waiters, the people who had spent years working tirelessly under Edward's rule without so much as a thank you. Starting now, every single employee gets a raise. And from this day forward, La Royale is a place where the people who work the hardest are the ones who are valued the most. For a moment, there was silence. Then, the restaurant erupted into applause. Employees exchanged stunned glances, some of them still too shocked to process what they had just heard. The waitstaff, the kitchen crew, the hosts, people who had spent years walking on eggshells, fearing Edward's wrath, were now cheering, grinning, celebrating a future they never thought possible. Sophia's eyes widened, a small disbelieving smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "You're serious?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel smirked, his gaze unwavering. "I don't say things I don't mean." She exhaled, shaking her head slightly. "You really did it, didn't you?" Daniel chuckled softly, looking around at the establishment that was now his. "I told myself I would." As the night went on, the restaurant buzzed with energy. Guests who had once looked down on Daniel now whispered his name with curiosity and admiration, their hushed voices filled with speculation about the man who had just pulled off the ultimate power move. Some even tried to approach him, eager to align themselves with him, eager to rewrite their narratives before it was too late. But Daniel? He wasn't interested in their validation. He wasn't here to impress them. He had already won. After finishing his rounds, checking in with the staff, ensuring that everything was running smoothly, Daniel finally stepped outside. The city air was crisp, the distant hum of traffic filling the night. His sleek black luxury sedan sat at the curb, exactly where the valet had left it. But he didn't get in right away. Instead, he turned back and looked up at the golden sign of La Royale, the same sign he had stared at 5 years ago when he had been thrown onto the cold pavement, humiliated and defeated. Back then, this place had been a symbol of his failure. Now, it was a monument to his success. A slow smile stretched across his face. He had come back. And he had taken everything they once told him he could never have. As he turned to leave, he caught one last glimpse of Edward Sinclair, still standing at the edge of the street, watching from a distance. His face was pale, his once expensive suit now rumpled, his entire empire ripped away in a single night. Edward's eyes met Daniel's one final time. There was no arrogance left in them. No defiance. Only regret. Daniel didn't say a word. He didn't need to. With a smirk, he slid into the back seat of his car. "Where to, sir?" his driver asked. Daniel leaned back, adjusting his cufflinks. "Home," he said smoothly. "I have a business to run." And as the car pulled away, disappearing into the city, one thing was clear. Daniel Carter was no longer the man they had laughed at. He was the man they would never forget.